blood satellite.
And that might be one of the biggest ones. It's a graph showing world lithium production from 1900 to 2007. And as you can imagine, lithium was very, very low throughout, like even the first half of the 20th century and prior to that. But he says the graph is pretty telling. Almost no lithium was produced before 1950, so human activity couldn't have been adding a meaningful amount to the groundwater. Serious lithium production started in 1950. Lithium definitely ends up in the groundwater. It's there in small concentrations naturally, but human activity adds more. So that's just, he goes into the exact science behind it. But, just think about the wild increase of lithium so let's take all three of these as true. It doesn't need to be one. Let's say it's all three of these chemicals at once. I think that's a pretty solid case. Like, at the very least, I think there is a strong correlation to obesity, but what else is correlated to all of this? And what's even worse is, back to that first page, what happened in 1971. Like, this is something what I'd like to keep in focus when we criticize things from an ideological point of view or an economic point of view. Like, you cannot remove the biological or even psychological, but largely biological aspects from this. Like, and again, like, this ties right into mental illness. Like, how is this not related to mental illness? How is this not related to depression? And you're going to medicate your way to that? Like, you are technically medicated into being depressed. That could be the story here too, right? Like, why aren't people having sex? Why are people depressed and killing themselves and shooting up schools and stuff? Well, maybe it's these three chemicals that were never here before, and you're telling that the only solution is more chemicals. Like, I don't.
Did you see the white pill in the comments at the end of part 3? The guy's like,
no.
Hey, one thing that isn't taken into account here about BMI is that there was a large change because of the Green Revolution. There's a large change in the average height of men and women in the industrial world. And the other thing that happened in the same period, much later on, but happened, was we now actually go to the gym. And people that do go to the gym and are fit and tall will have a BMI that's out of whack. And with a normal BMI measurement, it'll say they're fat. But if you measure their arm and their neck and their waist, you'll find, they're not fat. They're just chads. Their BMI is like 50 because they can crush your skull like a grape nut. So maybe it's actually that we're not fat at all. We're tall Atlantean ripped chads, and we're based, and everything's fine. Don't worry about it.
Get out of here.
The white man is back, baby. The white man is back.
This is a good white pill.
Yeah, there you go.
What do we do with that information?
Actually, everything's fine. So don't worry about it.
I don't know if you noticed this, but we're all chads. Actually. Yeah, but
fats aren't real.
Yeah, maybe we're just taller, which, the
man-led
genocide continues.
Listener, you are 6'8" and ripped, right? I know, me too. Everything's fine.
Or we're getting taller proportionally, which means that they're still short guys, but they're just taller than their ancestors who were short.
Or maybe old things just keep getting smaller. Maybe houses and yardsticks got smaller, but we stayed the same size.
It would be funny if the real problem with this generation, we're complaining about everything's too expensive and the houses suck. It's just because we're huge.
Nobody noticed. We're actually just huge.
Like, has anyone noticed that everything is like a dollhouse sized?
It's like, wait, my ancestors only ate 1 gram of beef a year? How is that possible? Oh, he was 8 inches tall. Oh, it was Lilliputian. Oh, Jesus.
I don't know if anyone's noticed this, but their birthday cakes are like the size of a muffin. Guys, look around you. Have we just been giants the whole time?
This is like our version of Mud Flood, but it's just like the ancient world was small and nobody noticed. So,
right here. Why are groceries so expensive now? Everything is smaller now, and everything's so expensive.
Brussels sprouts. Your grandparents called that romaine lettuce. Feel old yet? Yeah.
Stuart Little was voted most attractive, normal-heighted man.
He's a mouse.
He's a mouse. You ever notice, like, all these old newspapers where mice were hot. Now, I wanted to talk about this book that's we're going into like a really strange arc of books that I'm really excited about. And it's about networks, and it's about sort of decentralized systems and new ways to look at group formations and states and things like that. And I'm going to review, it's actually two books. There's one that I started reading and I read it, but it wasn't, I don't know if I can make it its own thing, but I'll kind of summarize it because it relates to it. One is this book called Misbehaving by Richard Thaler. And it's the history of behavioral economics told in a very anecdotal and even autobiographical way. And behavioral economics took a bit of heat recently because there was a very noteworthy researcher who proved to just be faking data.
Ariely's nearly 30-year career as a scholar and entrepreneur has been an exceptional success by all accounts. But there is a problem. A big, big problem. In August of 2021, an anonymous team of researchers posted evidence of fraud in one of Ariely's papers to an online blog. The results of the paper, which had already failed to replicate in 6 studies, was a key insight of one of Ariely's best-selling books.
And behavioral economics is about, okay, how does individuals' behavior impact their financial decisions? The idea, the big idea behind behavioral economics is that people on an individual level tend to behave irrationally. And that irrationality can be hijacked by sales and advertising and marketing. And like, you think that a lot of the times people, when they're operating with their money in a transaction, they're completely rational, but they're not. And why psychologically that happens. And there's this other book I read that I really liked. And I wasn't totally on board with it for the first bit, but that was just my limitations as a reader and a man. It's called The True State by Othmar Spann. Older book. Essentially, it's like a lot of these books we've covered before. It's giving a schematic for the fascist state. But it's an older German book, and it's written in this very cool Gothic font. But it's explained once you see people start talking about corporatism, which is what the book is about. It never says fascism. It talks about corporatism. It never even mentions National Socialism, but corporatism as the economic model for how to reorganize society. And this was occurring at a time when, communism was a competitor for this, and Marxism was still highly, highly in vogue. And what's interesting is it's an anti-capitalist book, but it's also severely anti-Marxist. And it takes, I think you would like it because it takes a very, what you might call a communitarian approach. Like a lot of corporatists, what they do is they hearken back to like the medieval guild system. And they would argue that this system of corporatism, is more like what we've had all throughout time. Now, I'll start by just setting up what I was reading in Misbehaving. It's an interesting book. I'd recommend people read it, but we've kind of covered parts of it in the past. But I wanted to start by the claim that individuals aren't very logical, especially when they're given total power over their finances in the capitalist system. There's a myriad of examples of people who don't behave rationally when it comes to finances. The entire book is to show how irrationality is coded into the system of exchanges at various levels, far beyond the materialist or market decisions.
Basically, until about 1940, economics was behavioral. And in particular, Adam Smith was a great behavioral economist. People think about him correctly as the father of modern economics, but wrongly they think about him as somebody who completely believed in laissez-faire and rational economic man. Before he wrote The Wealth of Nations, he wrote another book called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, in which he talks about passions and controlling our passions, and talked about we have an impartial spectator that is helping us control our passions. And the famous phrase, the invisible hand, appears exactly once in The Wealth of Nations. And it appears in a sentence that's extraordinarily weak.
One thing he found, and this is the thing I found most fascinating, is that they conducted studies, and you think that the human mind is attuned to like wealth and money, or money as a marker for, how much security or whatever you have. He said people's levels of happiness respond more to change than their actual level of wealth. And the way he phrased it was the human mind, we're actually a change measurement system. So it's like we're actually very bad at judging rationally how much is in our savings account, but we know when we've gained something and we know when we've lost something. And we're almost hardwired to want to not only gain stuff, but experience change. And he phrased it in such a way that our minds are biologically and evolutionarily designed to be like change measurement mechanisms. It's like once you realize that, you can kind of hack that system. And that's essentially what sales and marketing is. Like, for example, this is how sales work. So the idea that you can make someone buy a product, not because they need that product or even want that product. They just feel like this is a good deal. So they have something called sort of he calls it acquisition utility, that our minds will say like the value of that transaction makes us happy more than the value of actually getting that product. So that means you can drive people to actually buy a product if they feel like they're saving money on that product. This happens with women all the time. You'll notice like we have to get it because it's a sale, even if it's something you don't really need.
This is like doing antiques or yard sales or auctions, and it's like you end up coming home with all kinds of stuff, which is like according to like the value of that thing, you got an amazing deal. But if you had to ask yourself 2 hours earlier, is this something you would ever buy? They'd be like, no, why the fuck would I want one of those? So yeah, but it's $4. Of course I want it. It's worth $100. You can't lose at $4. And now you have it. And what do you fucking do? Like I told you, I have a gramophone now in my living room. Why? Why the fuck do I have a gramophone in my living room? Because it was just $10. So now I have it. So
there's other examples he gives where he calls something the JND, or the just noticeable difference. It's like we're more likely to drive an extra 45 minutes to save an extra $10 on a tool we're buying than save $10 on a $500 TV. You're still saving. Everything's the same, but it seems like it doesn't make a significant difference in the overall price, even though rationally it does. But no one does that. You know what I mean? So it's like how do we actually measure? It's what you're not measuring is the money. You're measuring how the human mind measures difference. And so we're just difference measuring engines, which seems like that's more of a evolutionarily beneficial thing, but it's way easier to hack on an individual level.
So I asked the following question. Suppose by attending this lecture today, you've been exposed to a rare fatal disease, and there's a 1 in 1,000 chance you're going to drop dead next week. Quick and painless death, not to worry. We have one cure. It's in this glass right here, and we'll sell it to the highest bidder. How much will you pay? Okay, that's question one. Question two is, Stanford is running some studies on that same disease, and they need volunteers for an experiment. All you have to do is walk into a room and expose yourself to 1 in 1,000 risk of death. There will be no cure available. What would you have to be paid to participate in that experiment? Now, according to economic theory, the answers to those questions should be approximately the same. And the responses I got were wildly different. So someone would say, oh, I'd pay $5,000 for that cure, but I wouldn't do that experiment for $500,000. So orders of magnitude difference.
And the same thing with time horizons. And we've mentioned this before, that throughout time, one thing we've always noticed is that the individual, regardless of really their culture, is bad at measuring time horizons. And that's just something you experience in life, that you measure the value of things differently as you move through time, like retirement savings or savings in general, right? Like nothing will change about the material itself, but it's just your subjective experience will weight things differently throughout time, even though it would be much easier if you started saving earlier. And what's interesting is like this same affliction was experienced by our ancestors as us. Anyway, I wanted to set the stage by showing sort of real life examples of how like we all kind of fuck each other over on an individual level. We're not good with finances. We think we are, but the entire purpose of behavioral economics, some people don't like it because it overstates how irrational people are, or overstates how that influences the market or the invisible hand of the market. But it's at least a component to explain why because if you believe that individuals are irrational, it could also mean that markets are irrational. And you can predict markets mathematically, but sometimes it's just weird things can happen, and you can tell that there's no rational justification for why it happens. That's why like bank runs happen and things like that. So that leads into The True State, which is, again, a book I found very, very fascinating, especially near the end, because I think it answered a lot of questions that, like, it's not just an economic model. I remember when we discussed the Green Book by Gaddafi, he presented a very simple, stripped down version of this, because it's supposed to be explained to Muslims. This is explained in a very German way. So it's very detailed. It's very to the point, and going through all the possible scenarios of where it could go and why this is addressing that. It's not very utopian. And that's why I always found fascinating about corporatism. It's not a utopian model. It actually looks to history and says, look, okay, it seems that things were we are community based. We're a community based people. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll start at the top because it involves some setup. It was published in 1921. So the context of when this book was written is a bit different, but I think a lot of it is still relevant. And he says, the current zeitgeist is defined by three circles of ideas: the political crisis of democracy, the economic crisis of capitalism, and the crisis of reform within Marxism. And he says, really what it is, it's the tension between the individualist form and the universalist form. The movement away from individualism and a search for spirituality. And he claims that Marxists actually so universalist in this sense is actually more spiritual, more communal, more like what the traditionalist types would talk about, whereas individualism is modernity, that's liberalism. And he argues in the book that Marxism, it wanted to be universalist, but it was actually individualist. It ended up making what he says is like hypercharged liberalism, because it made everything about the individual and their material conditions. And there's actually nothing spiritual. There's nothing really communal about Marxism, because it always puts the individual's material conditions at the center, which, if you've dealt with Marxists before, will become apparent when you deal with them. Because it's impossible, to his mind, it's impossible to have a true universalist or true collectivist organization if you're also ripping out spirituality, and you're ripping out hierarchy, and you're ripping, because that's what they did, ripping out the family structure and these configurations that human beings always seem to find themselves in. So if you're going to base your entire utopian ideology on effectively the sovereign individual, you just have hypercharged liberalism. That's his case anyway. He says, like, what is individualism in detail? Well, individualism is defined as the individual breaking away from the community, breaking away from the whole, the society, the culture, the supra-individual, as he calls it. It's ametaphysical, it's empiricist, it's relativistic, it's inductive, it's causally scientific, it's cosmopolitan, and ironically, it's centralizing. And And he makes a point here that I think this is one of the better criticisms of democracy, and it's the way the individual is forced to interact with the government. He says, due to the power being in the individual, the relationship with the large government must be more direct and immediate, which actually is it's like one central hub and 1,000 spokes going out. So it almost prohibits collective action. If you feel like your individual voice must be heard, your demands of power always be like, you rely so much on that vote in a sense, but that's not really how power and influence works. And that's why democracy doesn't really exist in that form. And he says, like, in the age of the individual, there is no inwardness. And he uses the word inwardness a lot. And that's not N-wordness, mind you. Inwardness, which is there's no spiritual, there's no connection to anything larger than yourself, you know? And this, when we talked about like the relationship between the individual and the monarchy, you know, a lot of people think, oh, it's like you're a serf and there's this king that you must worship. It's like, no, he was almost a representation of the culture. Things were a lot more interconnected in these older systems. So you wouldn't see yourself as a slave, you would see the king as a representation of like an interfacing with the divine, and you're a part of that, and there's a connectedness with everything. And if you searched inward, you would find that same, you're like a part of this bigger machine. And even the head of that machine was still a part of the machine. And he says universalism, the inverse of that, what's universalism? It's designed to be objective, a priori, deductive, intuitive. It's got purposeful science. It's permeated with the irrational and the metaphysical. And he says it's corporatist instead of capitalist. So it's almost the opposite of the individual. And it incorporates, you know, the strange, odd things that are generated from the people. It doesn't seek to wipe them away. And it seeks to manage the natural connections that exist between people and the ways they form groups. Because within the corporatist government and within the guild system, he's trying to say, okay, how do human beings, we're kind of going people first. You have the individual. Well, there really is no individual. Like you or I, like we're men, but we're in part of a family. You know, we're part of the family system in our immediate family, but then we also have our extended family. And then we have the community, right? So the entire idea of an individual standing apart from that is kind of silly. Like, you are in this mass. And I think the older that I get, the more I realize that the best way to live is a part of a community, not just adrift in the wind, right? So he says, you know, a lot of the liberals and Marxists would try and devalue that. And he's trying to say, like, you know, there almost is no concept of the individual. You have your identities that you identify with. And these identities are usually group oriented. Like it's like your family, and then also your church, and then also your trade. These are three groups that are overlapping over the entity called Judas, right? But there is a problem. There's a problem if you take either to the extreme. If you have inward, complete individuality, you have these atomized people who are very energetic and they're very purposeful, but there's no real spiritual genius in there, kind of like we have now. However, on the other end of the spectrum, if you're too collectivist, if you're too spiritual, you end up living in this kind of sedentary holding pattern, and there's no real innovation, there's no invention. Like, you need kind of a mix of both. And so what corporatism was seeking to solve was, how do we do the best of these both worlds? How do we leverage innovation and individual genius and invention while also not completely atomizing people? He says, and again, this is in the beginning where it's very philosophical, but I like a lot of what he says, so I'm just going to read it here. He says, community is the spiritual exchange, the supra-individual that lies therein, which constitutes all that is truly fruitful and essential in our lives, which imbues our life with sociality as a fundamental essential form. However, community ironically forms over dissimilarity over common identity. Like-minded individuals connecting implies like a break from the hive mind. And this is the difficulty this is what communists don't like. They don't like that, you know, guilds and organizations in effect separate you from the larger collectivism, right? But like, for example, like if you were in this society, like what you feel strongly about being an urbanite versus a rural guy, like those are fundamental to your identity, to the part where even if you're of the same race, even if you're in the same job, you feel like you're hostile to each other. But that's natural. That's just whenever you kind of get an identity, you other people, right? But he's trying to say that that's not something we should necessarily run away from, you know? Like, even that's what a guild essentially is, like you collectivizing over your job, right? It says the ideal universalist system, the corporatist system, promotes organic inequality and the components of societies that are communities rather than individuals, where individuals gain existence through integration. And this is something we're always talking about, like, you know, as an individual, what gives you value? Well, first of all, if you have a family, right? If you're just a guy walking around, you probably don't have a lot of family, but if you have got a wife and children, you seem to, I know some people hate when we talk like this, but I know you feel strongly about this. Like, if you do have a family, like you are in a higher position in society, you're raising kids and taking care of the next generation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And then but through that process, you become more ingrained in a community as well. And usually parents and family men will take more of an active role in their regional community or their village or their town or whatever it is, and in their church. And so you've got all these, you've got this like one guy whose value is increasing as he's affiliated with more groups. So you're not just locked into one identity. You can gather up more sort of groups, and become more relevant that way, instead of, again, just a guy who shows up and demands things from the government, right? And he says, and this will sound familiar to anyone who's read about fascism or corporatism, but he says society as a totality of values and the totality of these identities is like a truly intelligible being. It functions like an organism where each part is unequal and distinct, but serves a communal purpose, like the liver, the lungs, the heart. Each of these are separate and don't really communicate with each other, maybe don't have anything in common, but they're all connected through into this larger organism. He says, an organism is a super mechanism and a society is a super organism. I like that phrase, he said. He says, in a society of small communities, which is what we want, with their own allegiances and their own conflicts with everyone else, there needs to be a unifying spirit or idea to form the social whole. And this is essentially the superstructure. And this is the thing Marxists hate. Marxists hate the idea of a superstructure because they think capitalism is the superstructure. And in a sense, they're correct, because there needs to be sort of a unifying connective tissue between everything in society for it to be a society. And oftentimes it's unspoken. And you can always tell what the superstructure is by, you know, what is permitted within it. Like, nothing that truly damages the superstructure is allowed within the superstructure, which is the frame of the entire society. And in fact, it necessitates persecution to those who are hostile to it. Okay, yeah, it's basically what he's describing is like a medieval guild society in the modern age, and trying to figure out what that would actually look like. And he describes it as estates. So an estate would be sort of like a guild itself that is tied together in some like folk sort of way, and then those estates kind of meet to collaborate. He says the formation of the state is that of a conglomeration of spiritual estates, which are like corporations of communities. So that's the other way to think of it. Like, what's an estate? Think of all the communities, how you would define a community as like a coherent corporation based on values, and then an estate's a collection of them. And really, I guess what I'm trying to get at with all this that I found most fascinating is like a model for society that it doesn't try and do away with the individual, and it doesn't try and do away with the collective. Like, effectively, I know that a lot of people would hate it to be phrased this way, but it's like an extension of natural law, because natural law is always looking at like the law is what is natural. Like the family is the fundamental unit of society. That's what a lot of the libertarians and the Hoppians would say, right? And that is true, but usually there still exists in our scene this idea that everything begins and ends with the family, but what other forms does the family take? Because it's not just the family, it's the community. And it's not because, and a lot of guys who would hear this, it's like, okay, is my destiny just to be a family man? Am I just supposed to be like a peasant? It's like, well, no. Like, if you want to be a worker, if you want to have other identities, that is what they did in medieval guilds too. Like he says, the modern view of medieval Europe being primarily legalistic was incorrect, and said, wherever, like in Rome or Athens, wherever democracy prevailed, and never did away with the basic corporatist or guild relationships. And we're going to get into this in the next episode when we talk about the formation of secret societies. That's another way to talk about what we're talking about now. Like, what is a guild? Where you're like a group of men, a community, a group of families who are united over this one belief. And some people will view that as like a trade. Like, oh, you're the Masons. Well, Masons are actually, the Masons would be a great example. The Freemasons as like, you were laborers, but you also have this whole other spiritual dimension to it, and this whole other parallel hierarchy, and you have the ability to exist within a system but also exist as your own. And it kind of became this free floating thing. But a society, what if everyone had their own Freemason guild? What if everyone had their own like really, really binded fraternal organizations that represented your values, which strengthen your values? And in a sense, that's what each of us are trying to find. Like, in this dissident scene, we're trying to cobble together these sorts of things right now. And I think one of the problems that we run into is we don't know how to draw those lines. We actually don't know how to make our own spiritual estates or collectivize our values, because we think our values are too dissimilar. We kind of follow along religious lines, but even then, not really. But I think in a lot of ways, what we're trying to do is we're trying to reconcile the fact that we, as individuals, we feel lost and hopeless, but we don't really know how to collectivize, or we think that to collectivize it must be along class lines. But I like the idea that you can kind of collectivize along any lines you want. You can, and you can collectivize on lines that are also regional, that also incorporate the family, and maybe the family is the essential building block, but of that corporation, and not this larger amorphous society itself. Because if you just view the family as the basic building block of society, but you just want that family to have the same direct one-to-one relationship with the government, you're still having the same problem of that individualist democracy. You're just making 4 or 5 votes count as 1 vote. Like, you need to completely reshape how that family interacts with power and its own regional area. Anyway, I know that was a bit of a meandering one. Does any of that make sense?
No, that's cool. I actually like the idea.
And that's what's funny, because a lot of people that is in a lot of ways a fascist government. That's a corporatist government. But once you hear it explained, even if it's by a German, once you hear it explained, I don't find many people who disagree with the corporatist model, because what it really seeks is balance. What it really seeks is the balance between what we might consider natural law, but also the innovations and accelerations promised by liberalism. So it's like you don't, because if it's just the old guild model, you get a bunch of trad guys who are like, I just want to be a peasant. And they're saying, okay, we don't want to just turn the clock back and go back to medieval England. That's unreasonable, and it's not going to happen. But there's got to be a way to take what worked on that and transplant it in a modern nation state. So I think, did I cut you off there? I thought you were going to say something.
No, it's good.
And also the idea of there is private property within these estates, but it's a different sort of private property. It's like you get private property. Some of it's owned by the community. A lot of it's owned by you. But this is what I liked about when Gaddafi was talking about it. And maybe this is more of a Muslim approach to it, but he said, like, at the very least, every man needs his own house. Every man needs a space that he's in control of. And I think a lot of collectivists don't get that. They're like, oh, everyone owns everything. And in effect, you don't even own your house. I said, no, you need... I remember someone took exception to when I said this before, but it said, I think Hans Hermann Hoppe had said, the household needs to be a zone of anarchy. And everyone said, no, there's hierarchy in the house. The father's in charge. Like, no, anarchy from the state.
Yeah.
The idea
yeah.
is that in your house, the family's in charge of the family house.
Yes.
The state never goes into the fucking house. And that is how it should be. So you can never, and you need to keep that. And I think that's one thing that modern collectivists struggle with. They don't know how to reconcile the family and the private property stuff. But like, even now, as like an older guy, I'm like, yeah, you fucking need that. Like, most of us are going insane just because we can't have our own space in our own houses.
Mm-hmm.
I think going forward, what's the state promising us right now? More apartment buildings. That's not going to solve anything.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.